Okay, welcome to lecture number 14. This is our second part on alcohol and alcohol abuse. The previous lecture, we talked about the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics of ethyl alcohol, and in this lecture, we're going to talk about alcoholism and alcohol abuse. So we'll start off by talking about some of the consequences of alcohol abuse, talk about alcoholism and some theories about alcoholism, and then finally round out discussing some treatment options for alcoholism. So one of the worst consequences of alcohol abuse is called Korsakoff syndrome or Korsakoff's amnesia. This is caused by damage to the frontal lobe tissue, in particular the mammillary bodies, which are a subcortical structure involved in memory. This is a permanent amnesia. Essentially, this is an anterograde amnesia where we get no new memories or learning, but the individuals will still have a normal IQ. They will also confabulate, that is, they won't believe there's anything wrong with their memory. And then finally, this may improve or even recover with thiamine replacement. And so what happens in Korsakoff's amnesia or Korsakoff syndrome is because of the abuse to the liver in chronic alcoholism, we get reductions in the ability of the body to process or create thiamine. And thiamine is an important part of how our neural tissues work. So thiamine replacement is a potential therapy, and certainly taking a thiamine supplement for people who maybe drink a little more than they should might not be a bad idea. Fetal alcohol syndrome is another well-known consequence of alcohol abuse and use. This occurs in the offspring of mothers with a high blood alcohol content during critical stages of fetal development. There are about 3 to 5 FAS babies born for every 1,000 live births. This occurs in about 30 to 50% of alcoholic mothers. This rounds out to about 2.5 million infants in the U.S. every year. The features of fetal alcohol syndrome include central nervous system dysfunction. In particular, we see reductions in mental functioning, mental retardation, reductions in developmental milestones. We get reduced brain size, and we also get some behavioral anomalies, some of which are akin to ADHD, but also can include some sort of explosive personalities issues. These kids also have a retarded body growth rate, so they're going to grow at a slower rate than their peers. They can also have facial abnormalities, and we'll take a look at that on the next slide. In fact, that's how this syndrome was discovered, was a fairly adept and attentive resident, as I recall, noticed numbers of babies born with these facial abnormalities and set out to understand them. There are also the possibility for congenital heart defects in these infants. So pretty significant damage done to these infants prenatally from alcohol use. So here you can see that sort of characteristic FAS sort of face, changes in the shape of eyes. We get sort of different shapes of nose, some ear abnormalities, thinner upper lip, etc. So we get these sort of clear, flat mid-face features, etc. And you can see here on the right the brain of a normal baby with compared with the brain of a baby with fetal alcohol syndrome. This is a pretty significant problem. Finally, the last obvious consequence of alcohol abuse is alcoholism. This is a chronic disease that can have genetic, psychosocial, and environmental factors, as we talked in the last lecture. Its development and manifestations can include social factors, anxiety, depression, self-medicating, etc. The disease is often progressive and fatal, certainly characterized by impaired control over drinking, preoccupation with drug, alcohol, use of alcohol, and this is despite potential adverse consequences, loss of jobs, loss of spouses, etc. And also lots of distortions in thinking, the most notable of which is denial. And so this is a pretty great definition from Morris and Flavin about what alcoholism really is. But it's a chronic disease, and it certainly is a disease. And I think that's the important thing to keep in mind. So let's take a look at the history of the alcoholism disease model. In 1935, Alcohol Anonymous was founded sort of on a moral model and a religious model. I know a lot of people have found success with AA, and I think that's wonderful. I do want to say that modern research indicates this is not the best approach to treating alcoholism. So AA offers a spiritual and behavioral framework for understanding, accepting, and recovering from alcoholism. And again, if it's worked for you, and that's wonderful. And I think that you should continue to use that if it's something that works for you. If it is not, there are other treatment options. In 1946, Jelenic proposed this modern disease concept by defining alcoholism as any use of beverage alcohol that causes damage to the individual drinker, to society, or both. And this is where we actually get substance abuse disorder in the DSM is generally defined as disruptions in social or occupational functioning, etc. And so we oftentimes see damage to the individual drinker through loss of relationships and losses of jobs, damage to society by loss of their productivity, or they've gotten into an accident and harmed somebody else because of their alcoholism. 1957, we get the AMA defining alcoholism as a disease. By the 70s, we get this redefined as a chronic, progressive, and potentially fatal disease. It gets expanded to include those genetic, psychosocial, and environmental factors. So an understanding that not everyone is at the same risk. And also there are a number of factors that are outside of our control when it comes to the issue of whether or not someone might develop alcoholism. There's a behavioral model that indicates that drinking is a learned but maladaptive behavior, and certainly probably part of it includes that. As we talked in the last lecture, alcohol has an anti-anxiety effect, and so that alleviation of anxiety is a negative reinforcer. If you think back to the basic principles of reinforcement, when you remove an aversive stimulus, that's reinforcing. And typically in classes we talk about, we'll be shocking a rat, and then when you take away that painful shock, that's reinforcing. Well, in alcoholics, oftentimes that removal of anxiety is that kind of negative reinforcement. And that's where we get, very similarly, the self-medication model. And it's simply a means of self-medicating for psychological distress, including anxiety and including depression. And so this is an important issue as well. As we start thinking about how people might need help, it might be that we need to help them with another issue in order to deal with their alcoholism. If we can deal with the other issue, the alcoholism may go away all on its own. There are certainly genetic contribution. The disorder occurs in all classes of society and all walks of life. It does tend to run in families. Children of alcoholics have a much greater risk, particularly male children of alcoholics. So the normal prevalence is about 3 to 5% in the population. If you are the child of an alcoholic, it's 20 to 50% for males. For females, the normal prevalence is about 0.1%. For children of alcoholics, it's about 3 to 8%. So there is clearly a significant factor involved in alterations of the gene that you might inherit. Now, it's entirely possible that that genetic contribution is an epigenetic one. We're still trying to tease all of this apart, so it's an important thing to keep in mind. Alcoholism also has a lot of comorbidities. That is, it goes along with other psychopathologies. About 30 to 50% of alcoholics meet the criteria for major depression. We talked a little bit about how alcohol can affect serotonin receptors. That certainly low-risk males might benefit from a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor for treating the depression, and it might help with their alcoholism. Again, 33% have coexisting anxiety disorder, and they're managing their anxiety through alcohol. 38% also have an impulse control problem. And this feeds into alcoholism because they're unable to control that impulse to drink. And so that's another issue. We tend to just presume that individuals have a dual diagnosis, that is, they have a comorbid illness, unless we can prove otherwise. People don't tend to become alcoholics out of the blue. There are often other things going on. This is why you see survivors of abuse, people with PTSD, all of those individuals are at much greater risk for alcoholism than others. So I think this really gets us to the stage where we have to start thinking about, instead of saying, well, they're just drunk, they just don't know how to stop drinking, but trying to get at that compassionate point where we understand this individual may be going through other things, and we may need to help them with those. I think that's a really important part of that. So that gets us to treatment. The ideal goals of pharmacotherapy ought to include reversal of the acute pharmacological effects of alcohol, treatment and prevention of withdrawal symptoms and complications, and maintenance of abstinence and prevention of relapse. These are really important parts of treatment. Certainly we want to treat coexisting psychiatric disorders, and oftentimes if we can treat that psychiatric disorder, we actually already have treated the underlying root cause of the alcoholism. And that's, I think, a critical part of this. We also want to try to limit the neuronal injury during detoxification. We want to block withdrawal-inducing glutamatergic activation and glutamate receptor upregulation. We want to block any potential seizures because those certainly can cause neuronal injury. And so we want to really be very cautious during detoxification of these individuals. So these are goals for the pharmacotherapy of alcohol abuse and dependence. There are, of course, other therapies for alcohol dependence, including cognitive behavioral therapy and, of course, things like Alcoholics Anonymous. So as we start thinking about treatments at this point, we can't reverse the acute pharmacological effects of alcohol. If you go into the hospital with alcohol intoxication, the best they can do is supportive treatment, put you on an IV to try to get your kidneys pumping out as much alcohol as possible. They may induce vomiting, that sort of thing. But other than that, it's just going to be supportive care. There's nothing they can do to reverse the pharmacological effects. So currently, we have pharmacotherapies, available to treat and prevent withdrawal symptoms, to try to reduce the relapse to drinking behaviors. So we treat and prevent withdrawal symptoms usually with benzodiazepines. Reducing relapse to drinking behaviors might include antabuse or buprenorphine or other drugs such as Wellbutrin. We want to treat complications in alcohol-dependent people who are decreasing or discontinuing their alcohol use. So again, trying to maintain, make sure they're not having seizures, etc. And we want to reduce the glutamate release and glutamate receptor upregulation, causing subsequent neuronal damage. And there are certainly drugs available for that. Let's take a look at these therapies for management of alcohol withdrawal. As I've said, benzodiazepines are an important part of this. They increase GABA activity. They ameliorate, I don't know why I can't say that. Sorry. They ameliorate withdrawal symptoms and can prevent seizures and the DTs. We oftentimes like to use long-acting to prevent these withdrawal symptoms and then maintain them or slowly withdraw them, which allows them then to function normally. The drawbacks of this approach, of course, are sedation, some psychomotor deficits. They have additive interactions with alcohol, so if the patient's not compliant, and they also have their own abuse and dependence liabilities, and we'll talk about more about that when we get to sedatives. So that's benzodiazepines. These are drugs like Xanax, Ativan, lorazepam, diazepam, which is Valium. All of those are potential drugs for treatment at this stage. Some anticonvulsant mood stabilizers have fewer limitations than the benzos. The older anticonvulsants are effective, but they have some side effects of their own, including liver and pancreatic problems, and we probably already have those in an alcohol patient, so caution would be warranted. So carbamazepine or Tegretol or valproic acid or Depakote are potential. There are newer anticonvulsants that are less toxic and may have some significant potential, such as gabapentin and oxcarbazepine, so Neurontin, or Trileptal. These are potential treatments for managing alcohol withdrawal symptoms. So trying to maintain abstinence and prevent relapse, there are some alcohol sensitizing drugs like disulfiram or antabuse, which produces an adverse reaction if a patient drinks. Generally, they get violently ill. Some opioid antagonists, such as naltrexone, may limit the reinforcing properties of alcohol, and because those involve that opioid system. So blocking those should reduce craving by reducing the associated positive reinforcement. So essentially what we're doing is we're trying to desensitize or get rid of the rewarding properties of alcohol by disconnecting that reward from the induction of alcohol. And so this is essentially like when you are trying to get to an extinction trial in treating an animal where you stop rewarding them, eventually the behavior will extinguish. And so that's essentially what the opioid antagonists are trying to do. Compliance, though, is a particular problem with these types of drugs. Compressate or Camprol is designed to maintain abstinence in alcoholics after detox. It's both a GABA agonist and NMD inhibitory, so it's similar to alcohol. It's comparably effective to naltrexone. The combination of both drugs may be additively effective. So if you look here on the right, we get the best response in terms of proportion of patients abstaining from relapse with naltrexone plus a comprosate. Certainly far better with one of those drugs than placebo, but the combination of them seems to have the best long-term effects over after about 40 days. Some dopaminergic drugs include such drugs as bupropion or Wellbutrin. These have a theoretical use. They have both positive reward and withdrawal, seem to involve the dopaminergic reward system. The data seems to be mixed on these as well. There are other areas of interest, things like serotonergic drugs, perhaps nicotinic mechanisms, and finally cannabinoid mechanisms. But these are in their early stages, and we're still working on trying to figure out how these might work. Well, the take-home message is trying to treat alcoholism as a complex issue. Certainly treating underlying conditions is probably the most important part of that treatment. And so thinking about that as a first-line response is particularly important. Obviously, medically dealing with withdrawal, and then potentially some types of talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, etc., are probably appropriate as well. All right, our next lecture is going to be on inhalants and their effects.